webinar today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have Grace Molino, who is going to be telling us about her project, the agricultural land tenure, I believe is what it was called. And we are going to first hear from her and how the project is going, and then we'll have time to talk about the SALT conference and the SWISLR all hands meeting. I think it might be really helpful to have a time where we can all just hear what's going on, hear what the plan is, and kind of start making the plans for all of our projects going forward. So with that, I am very pleased to have Grace here today. She is at VIMS and is advised by Dr. Matt Kerwin, and she primarily studies like salt marshes and sea level rise and marsh transition. But today we have the pleasure of hearing her talk about the SWISLR project of salty agricultural lands. And so Grace, please take it away, and I will stop sharing my screen so you can as well.
Okay. Do you see the? Okay. Excellent.
Great.
All right. So thank you for that introduction. So as Kira said, I'm Grace, PhD candidate at VIMS working with Matt. And so I'm going to talk today just briefly about the project ideas that came out of the SWISLR conference last summer that Becky and I have been working on and chatting about for the last few months. Kind of a sketch of what we've done, our plans, and very interested to hear your thoughts and possibly how this project can still be shaped as it's still very much in the initial stages. So just kind of a brief orientation. So Becky and some of the others in SWISLR, including myself, do a lot of work on the Eastern Shore, the Delmarva Peninsula, which encompasses a portion of Maryland, a portion of Virginia, and the entirety of Delaware. And so this is a rather rural section of the coast that fronts the Chesapeake Bay on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other, and is an area of rapid sea level rise that has seen a lot of impact to the agricultural fields on this peninsula. And so a recent paper that came out that Becky and some others in SWISLR were part of showed that the visible salt patches, so these kind of white areas, you can see my mouse on the fields, have almost doubled from 2011 to 2017, and over 8,000 hectares of farmland converted to marsh during that same time period. Looking at kind of a finer resolution just at Somerset County, which I've underlined here in red, they determined that the likelihood of upland conversion is affected largely by elevation, distance to shoreline, and upland land use. And that upland land use is a significant contributor even when you control for elevation as well as distance to shoreline of the different upland land uses. And that agricultural land is actually the land use that is most likely to convert to marsh of the anthropogenic land uses along the shore. And so landowners have reacted to SWISLR in sort of a suite of responses. This framework that I use here, resist, adapt, and retreat, has come out of this review paper that Matt is leading, that some others, including Kate Tully and Karen, are all involved in. And so this is just an example, not a comprehensive list of responses, but they include digging drainage ditches, creating small earthen berms around the property, adding gypsum to combat the salinization. And so these kind of focus on this idea that the landowner does not want to change the activities within their farm, and instead they're going to do things to allow them to continue to grow the same crops, farm the same fields for as long as possible. The kind of next step, the more adaptation, is kind of this acknowledgement that things are changing. And so you see farmers who are planting more salt tolerant crops within these fields, or who are changing to completely different land uses. So still using the same field, but not necessarily for, say, growing wheat or corn anymore. And then kind of the final response is either partial or complete field abandonment. And so this could be areas of the field that are perhaps too soggy to still grow crops in. You can see here this little marsh forming in the corner behind the berm, and then over here too salty for anything to grow. And so either willingly or unwillingly, the farmers are beginning to sort of retreat back from those coastal sections of their fields. And so the project that Becky and I have been working on and chatting about these last few months focuses on this alternative land use response to SWISLR. And so I have an example of one of our field sites on the Eastern Shore in Somerset County. And so this is a classic example of a farm along the coast with these major salt patches. In this case, here they're along the drainage ditch, here along the marshes that front their field. And so this image was taken in 2015. And then this is another one, same field, but in 2021. And so in this case, the landowner has chosen to take this field out of production and build an impoundment on the field, which I've outlined here in red. And so these are these kind of raised earthen structures that completely enclose the field and allow them to be purposely flooded, usually to attract waterfowl for recreational hunting. So just some other examples. This main image is a waterfowl impoundment that's been planted purposely with freshwater marsh plants. And in fact, the landowner I spoke with put a lot of time and energy into figuring out how to create both a geomorphologically diverse impoundment as well as an ecologically diverse impoundment with different plants to try and attract waterfowl. And then these are images of an impoundment that is actively being built. So this top one kind of standing on top of the earthen levee that encloses the field. It hasn't been completed yet, but you can see sort of the salt stress field, the standing water. In the back, kind of where those standing trees are, is actually a ghost forest that fronts salt marsh. This is in Dorchester. And then just this lower image, trying to give you a sense of kind of scale. I mean, this is a massive feature that they're building using heavy machinery on the field. And this levee is about 2 meters in height, and the intent is to purposely flood it after completion. And that's all from talking with the landowners. And so some of the consequences of impoundments that we think about, and so I wasn't entirely sure how to break these down. Positive and negative didn't really seem like an appropriate one because it really totally depends on who you are and where you're standing. So instead, looking at intended consequences, and so recreation, as I mentioned, these are often filled for hunting, recreational hunting, and so this can also be an alternative income for the landowners. In some cases, you have the formation of these hunt clubs on this private property that are owned by people out of state. People from all over come in to hunt in the winter. It does create waterfowl habitat. You have a diversity of habitats. So like I said, you now have this freshwater marsh in some cases where you might have had abandoned fields or salt marshes coming in. And then of course it limits lateral salt marsh migration. And one interesting thing I wanted to point out, this image here, this is from a website for this company, Orion Land and Wildlife Management, which is a company on the Eastern Shore of Maryland that specializes in building impoundments on people's fields and planting them with specific crop types to attract whatever species of interest you're in. And so it's not just kind of alternative income for the landowners themselves, but also now these businesses that have popped up to support this changing land use. And then of course, there's always unintended consequences. So altered hydrodynamics, this has come from talking to some of the landowners whose neighbors have put in impoundments. And since then, they have now found their own property to be flooding more than it had previously. So this is entirely anecdotal. And certainly would be interesting to take a look at, but I imagine it now has these, almost these like above ground pool type situations with these permeable earthen features containing them. So you're going to have water ending up where it hadn't been previously, and also you're going to now have like blocked incoming storm surge or high tides that are deflected onto neighboring properties. And then methane emissions. So this is something that was just looked at in this recent study that came out last year. But these now impounded freshwater marshes can end up as methane emitters, which would not likely have been the case if you had allowed salt marsh to migrate naturally into these fields. And so these are just some of the things that we are thinking about in terms of the implications of this alternative land use along the Eastern Shore. And so the focus of this project is largely within Somerset County. And so this data set of impoundments comes from another project that I had been working on as part of my dissertation. So I have pulled out here the tax parcel map for Somerset County, Maryland. All of the light orange parcels are parcels of land in which farmland was lost to marsh since 1984, looking at a study from Yaping Chen, a postdoc, former postdoc in our lab. And I should say that those parcels are not the actual area of land use that has been lost. That is just the size of the parcel on which that land was lost. But often these are small patches, so it's difficult to see those at the scale of a whole county. So this is just for visual, so you can see the distribution. And then similarly, the red parcels are the ones that have impoundments on them. And again, those are not the size of the actual impoundments. Those are just highlighting where the impoundments are. But overall, there is 80 impoundments surrounding almost 3 square kilometers of land along Somerset County. I spent some time in the fall going back through historical aerial imagery to try and figure out when these impoundments were installed, or at least within a couple of years based on available photography. And so some of them date back pre-1959, which is when my last photograph was, and then to as recently as 2018, the majority of them being installed in the early 2000s. And they range quite drastically in size, but the majority of them are rather small and put in on individual farms, like I showed in some of those previous photos. And so the kind of overarching question that has been driving some of this work is, can we identify personal or property attributes which affect if a landowner will choose an impoundment as a saltwater intrusion response? And so Becky and I have identified a number of possible attributes that are available from remotely sensed data at a resolution and scale that is necessary to look at Somerset County. And so these first few are using the Maryland tax parcel data. So we're really interested in how land ownership affects this response. And so a lot of these parcels, you see landowners who live out of the county or out of the state entirely. As I said, sometimes you have these hunt clubs that have moved in. And so we do think that that might have an impact on these decisions, as well as the length of ownership and the parcel size. And then some more environmental variables looking at distance to shoreline of the parcel, salinity of the nearest water body, as well as the elevation of the parcel. And so this is just kind of the working list that we have right now that we've explored a bit that we think is feasible to match to the impoundment data set that we already have. And so some of the future work that would need to be done for this project. So the main one right now would be matching the impoundments to the tax parcel data. So a lot of this can be done in GIS, but the tricky thing is that the tax parcel data has to be from the year that the impoundment was installed. So you have to kind of dig through some of these historical records, which can get a little time consuming. And you also run into issues where some of the older data is on software that is no longer functioning. So that has been an interesting exploration. We also need to determine companion parcels without impoundments to act sort of as a control for this. And then to have that all in this logistic regression model to relate the presence or absence of impoundments to parcel characteristics. For all questions regarding the statistics of the model, please forward to Becky. And then something we thought would be really interesting would be companion interviews. So selecting a number of farmers and actually talking with them more in depth about their decision process and what motivated that switch to an alternative land use. And so we kind of put all of this out here and are also open to kind of other ideas, what people have thoughts on the project. It's just really been the two of us chatting about this for quite some time. So open to people's thoughts, as well as anyone feeling particularly inspired by this project to join and take part in some of this. I think especially for something like the companion interviews, it would be wonderful to have some other folks help out with that. But that is, I think, everything. And so, yeah, I think I and Becky would be happy to hear your thoughts, and thanks for joining on this Friday afternoon.
Thanks, Grace. And people can feel free to unmute and ask their questions or have comments to Grace and Becky, who is also here. Or if you don't feel like unmuting or talking, you can post it in the chat and I can just read it out.
I did have one question. I'm sorry if I missed this in the beginning, but are there programs from the USDA or NCRS, like conservation reserve or wetland easements, that help with conversion to impoundments and and creating like recreational land, or is this something that's completely an investment by the farmer?
That's a great question, and something that I have looked into a bit. There are some programs that do help farmers promote like wildlife habitat on their property. And so I was just reading about this yesterday, that Maryland was one of the first, I believe, one of the first states to enact some of its national legislation, but to be able to kind of bring that and support their farmers. So I do suspect that that influences kind of this influx of impoundment creation that we see in the early 2000s. That's something that I would hope to look for when we kind of have a bit broader of a data set. But yeah, absolutely. But interestingly, we don't see these impoundments in Virginia. So I work a lot there for kind of my other dissertation chapters. And so I haven't really been able to parse out why Maryland has been so active in supporting their farmers with that legislation, but not, just a little bit further south. Yeah.
Yeah, just gonna add to that policy piece, because just like you said, there are a bunch of policies or incentive programs in Maryland, and there's also a lot of NGO work, but then we also talking to some of these farmers, not all of them are going through programs, some of them are doing it on their own. So it's not so it seems like there's a mixed bag of the avenue by which landowners are putting these in.
Even within one farm. So some of the images I showed of one of those, that original impoundment that I kind of traced out, he's got one impoundment that was paid for using a state or federal program, and another one that he paid for out of pocket because for whatever reason it didn't qualify. So it's a real mixed bag.
Maybe along similar lines, is the cost of these impoundments like uniform across what you're seeing, like by size or something?
I have not investigated the cost of building them. The landowners say that it is a very substantial amount of money to put them in, but I think it also depends on if they have the farm equipment. So some of them are putting them in themselves with their own equipment, so that's a big cost savings for them. But those that don't have that capacity be a lot more expensive and a lot more work. And then, as I said, some of the federal programs will pay for them, but I'm not entirely sure why it pays for some and not others at this point.
James, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Just trying to start the video. Well, there we go. Yeah, thanks, Grace. Really interesting work. As a hydrologic modeler, I'm wondering a little bit, so you say that some neighbors are anecdotally saying that there is changes in flooding and other things. Do you have a sense that is that potentially real given the size of these, or is that just people complaining because they got flooded? And if so, is this a place where some modeling could be a valuable addition?
I think absolutely modeling would be really wonderful to have in this situation. These impoundments are massive, and there's a lot of water that is stored in them for months at a time. So I would imagine it is entirely possible that I say that, not being a hydrological modeler, nor being a farmer. And also these farmers have, in this case, the landowner I was talking to has been working on this farm for decades and is a family farm passed down. And so he was the one who said after these impoundments were installed, he noticed a change. And so you know, if anyone's going to have an idea of changes in flooding patterns, it would be these landowners who are more familiar with their land than anyone.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds like it might be something worth investigating then.
Yeah.
For next steps.
And it seemed like there's kind of two pathways by which that flooding can happen. One is that sort of the any sort of coastal flooding that might normally happen being blocked by and then spilling over, versus any sort of leaks or that sort of thing from the impoundments themselves. So,
well, and also though, just the impoundments, if you've got this kind of raised water table in that zone, that's just taking up space such that any other flooding can't percolate, can't infiltrate either. So I can imagine a few different things that are happening there. So yeah.
And we also though simultaneously are like reaching, you know, like the coastal flooding is increasing
right
at this exact same time period. So differentiating it without the use of the modeling is really hard. So
yeah. All right.
Well, and flooding isn't the only problem for guys trying to work a field. It's even just longer periods of moisture, at least in the Northwest. They're talking about like the fields are wetter longer in the spring, and so they can't access with their heavy equipment, you know, weeks later than normal. Even if it's not flooded, just being wet, you can't drive it back up there, for example.
Well, and that, I mean, that could also be a problem for crops as well. Just if there's, I mean, too much moisture is bad the same way that too little moisture are in slightly different ways. But yeah.
I have a question that's actually from Emily, who's in chat, but we've got computer issues. She's working at home. But we were wondering if Alex Manda is seeing the conversion rates here in North Carolina. You said you weren't seeing them in Virginia, and that brings up the question of how much of these incentives are federal versus regional versus state, and do we see different attitudes towards these projects differing across the coastal plain?
Right. So there's some discussion similar to one of the questions I was asked earlier about the USDA providing funds, and so people are anxious to put in berms or other types of structures to help with in their minds, at least the farmers, when we've had these conversations with stakeholders, they want to put in barriers. Not necessarily for impoundments per se, but in their minds, they're thinking that barrier will prevent the saltwater from coming in. And so they haven't necessarily thought about converting the land to an impoundment, but rather putting in a barrier that will prevent the saltwater from coming in. So those are the ideas that they have had. We haven't had a lot of pings from people that actually have converted land to impoundments, at least that I'm aware of, in the region that we're working on. And so I might have to converse with some of the extension agents about what they have seen on the ground, but I haven't heard any significant drive to do that as of yet.
We also see landowners interested in installing berms to protect their property as well. As something that I've also been working on for separate projects. But that is something that there's been some question about the if they'll be permitted to do it or not based on the wetland laws in Virginia and Maryland, but I'm more familiar with the ones in Virginia. So I'm curious down in North Carolina if there's any sort of state level legal barriers that these landowners are trying to overcome to install those features.
As a quick response, I don't think there are any barriers when it comes to regulations. I think that the constraint right now is money, and so people are interested in trying to find pockets of money that can help them put in these barriers on their property. But I haven't come across any legislative regulation or policy barriers.
Interesting.
I'm gonna read out from the chat again. I believe Emily is saying it would be really interesting, and I agree, to do a regional comparison of the willingness to resist versus adapt versus retreat among the farmers on these permitting. If we're already seeing differences between Grace's area and North Carolina, I think it would be really interesting to look at the incentive programs that may differ and cause the differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, yeah, requires a lot of local knowledge to be able to parse out some of these things. So it'd be great to look at at these things in different regions with folks who are more familiar with those laws and common practices.
Do you think what you and Becky are proposing here could be applied to these different areas, like direct one-to-one to methods?
I'm mostly familiar with the data sets available in Maryland and Virginia. So in terms of like digitized tax parcel records, that would be somewhat essential. I think the environmental data would be, we would be able to get that from other places as well, but it's really the tax parcel records. And then if there's data sets of these other features, that impoundment data set was something that I've been working on for another project that didn't get used. So I was interested, another alternative use for this. But if we had other data sets, that is a time-consuming component to create that. But certainly if that existed elsewhere, I think Alex has his hand raised. Maybe he has a response to that.
Actually, I don't have a response to that. I had a question for you with respect to data, though, geospatial data, seeing that you've spent so much time looking at all these aerial imagery or satellite imagery. What type of format are those images? Are they in a GIS usable format that could also be applied to some other things? Because one of the things that we are sort of looking at is just the spatial distribution and coverage of these areas, right? And that are salty. And one of the sort of conundrums that we're thinking about addressing and we've talked about previously is why do you have some of these patches that are like in the middle of the field, right? And so, but I'm just thinking, can we use some of the images that you have using some geospatial techniques to then somewhat quantify and see where they are? And maybe it's just a unique feature that there's just that one, but how ubiquitous or problematic are those types of features, and what other patterns might we see since you've already done all this work? If you have collected all this data, could we squeeze that lemon a little bit more to get some more juice out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything I do is in GIS. So a lot of the data sets, the environmental data sets are all in raster file formats. The tax parcel data is in shape files. My impoundment data sets are in shape files. The study that was looking at the salt patches that had been done in Delmarva, I think actually Dr. Mandala's, I thought I saw her on this call, but she was the lead author on that study. And I believe most of that data is also publicly available, and the methods can also be done using geospatial techniques. I use a lot of the high resolution imagery I use is from the NAEP imagery. So the National Agricultural Program imagery that's at I think it's 0.6 meter resolution right now. If you go back, it's about 0.1 meter resolution. But yeah, all the data sets that I use are all publicly available, other than the one impoundment data set, which I created, which will hopefully be published at some point soon, and then will be publicly available also.
I have one more kind of question of, do you think impoundments is like an end case where farmers are trying to decide what to do with their field and they've applied different techniques and then they resort to impoundments? Or do you think impoundments is the almost answer that these people in the area have in response to SWISLR?
That's a great question. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I was trying to differentiate the question there, because you're saying, so one is like, is this like they're giving in and this is the best that they can do versus it being an opportunistic response, like positive? Sorry, I didn't quite follow the question.
Yeah,
And by the way, yes, Ducks Unlimited pays for a lot of these as well, helps with these. See another question there. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm asking. I'm just curious, and I think this is something you probably will find with the interviews of, is this almost a like final case for people? Like, is this their almost final solution, or is this a, yay, we found this, let's do it? Like, is it more a positive connotation, or is this something in like their last resort? This is like what they need to do. that's I guess not a very answerable question right now. I guess something that I'm more curious of.
I can only offer a few anecdotes from landowners that I've talked with. We do see when some of these features I do think are put in by landowners who are out of state. And so I think that perhaps the farmer has decided to move on for whatever reason. And so these landowners out of state who are turning these former agricultural fields into more of like weekend destinations are putting them in. I don't know if you would consider that like a last resort, because this is kind of what they want to do with the property. So I think that's more of like an opportunistic situation. I do see though in some of the aerial imagery, when you look at it through time, sometimes you see impoundments pop up and then a few years later they disappear. And it's a lot of investment to put these in. And so I don't know why they would take them down later, but certainly perhaps they thought they would use this as an alternative for the field and it didn't work out, or for whatever reason, that was no longer the final end use that they wanted. But that's something that we would have to get at with interviews. They can only make so many assessments from aerial imagery.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just the decision to put an impoundment in, because if you're talking about the logistic regression model, for them putting it in, I feel like it could potentially change if how they're viewing impoundments like is different. So if they're doing it more just opportunistic and saying, "Ooh, yay, let's put this in," it's almost as soon as they can. And then I feel like a logistic regression wouldn't necessarily get at exactly why they're putting it in, because that will then differ based on person by person. But if it's a last resort, this is the last thing I'm able to do, it's almost a let's run through all of our options, now we have to do this, and the logistic regression would be perfect for identifying like where it's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think looking at length of ownership is something that will shed a little light on that too, right? If it's put in right after the property is sold, or if it's the same owner for 2 decades who just decides to add one to the field. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot that won't be captured just based on the remote sensing data that we have available, for sure.
Well, I'm excited for your interview. So are there any more questions in the chat or in the room?
I did have one, if that's all right.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm a bit envious of your research because you're very close to farmers and speaking to people, which is awesome. And one thing that I'd like to pick your brain about is, do you have a sense of when farmers started feeling that these impoundments were becoming necessary? Like, did these sort of land changes something, like when, at what year around? Like, was this something that started in the 90s or just like the early 2000s of, was like, oh, this is progressively becoming a really big issue that we need to start thinking more in advance for?
I do not think that my sample size of farmers is large enough to be able to effectively answer that question. Certainly Karen Gadan and Kate Tully work with a lot more farmers and have for many more years on the Eastern Shore, who would probably be able to give you a better sense. Becky works with them as well, so maybe she would have more, but I would not even want to take a guess from the few number of farmers that I've worked with.
Yeah, it just feels there's a lot of anecdotalness, depending upon who you talk to, different perspectives. So yeah, and I don't know, and you can't really tell from the impoundment thing again, because there's also policy changes and that sort of thing. But in terms of and it also depends upon where you were, where you are along the coastline, right? Where you lower versus higher elevation. There's just sort of a time trend of who's being affected when.
Seeing no more hands being raised, I would like to thank Grace again for giving us that update and overview of this really cool and interesting work. I can't wait to see everything that comes out of it.
Yeah, thanks for all the great questions.
And I think we will now be transitioning to talking generally about the SALT and the SWISLR meeting. I'm going to potentially do something a little silly here, but since we have everyone on Zoom, can people do a reaction? Do the kind of celebrating reaction if you are joining for SALT and or SWISLR. Awesome. So I'm really happy to see all of those and seeing how many people are going to be joining us, because I think this is going to be a really cool conference of the SALT conference, where we have a lot of really interesting sessions. And then we'll be able to kind of break down everything we've learned throughout the year, throughout specifically the SALT conference, to all get together and talk about envisioning coastal futures. And that will be our kind of SWISLR all hands event. We'll have Christy Garborough back with us, who was the graphic facilitator from last year. And we'll have a World Cafe where we're discussing these futures and what it kind of means to be living and researching in this salty area. We then are going to have our kind of SWISLR all hands meeting is going to be a little bit, I don't want to necessarily say smaller, but it'll be a little bit more focused than last year, where we have almost all of our projects signed up to come. We have leaders for all of our projects signed up, and we are going to have little smaller groups be meeting and convening directly after our all hands World Cafe. And so that day of the 13th will be World Cafe in the morning, and then you all go off into your breakout groups. So I'm saying this now because I want you all to know that you will be pretty much working directly with the project lead. I won't necessarily be facilitating any of the other individual projects. And so you'll be looking to your project lead to say kind of what you're going to be doing, where you're going to be doing it, but I have a little bit more specifics on that. And then how long you're going to be staying as well. And why I'm saying the specifics of how long you're going to be staying is because the SWISLR really wants to support a meeting of these projects that can be beneficial to the project and push it forward. And so if directly after the SALT conference is not beneficial for your project, like if you don't have enough people or you don't have the right timing of it, we want to know that so that we can help you potentially make another meeting of your individual project at a later date throughout the year so you can get the right people, get the right data, get the right time, etc. So you have basically the June 11th, the start of the SALT conference, until June 14th, the end of our SWISLR kind of support, to decide if you want to get together with your group and work. And it's really a kind of working time for you all to get your projects worked on and get kind of in-person connections with each other. And I think I'm going to leave it there, potentially for talking about the general ideas of everything else, but I want to see in the room, I have a couple of people who are leads of this project, and so I wanted to identify that we will have people from the Center for Climate Scenarios project, that's Anna Braswell's project. We will have people from Over, Under, and Through, that is Ashley Helton's project, that's talking about the gap analysis of hydrology. We will have people from the Telling Ghost Forest Stories project, and that is Justin Wright's project. We will have people from the Delarian, which is not a project that we presented on. Delarian, that's not a project we presented on, but we'll be kind of kicking off with this SWISLR meeting. We will have people from this project, the Agricultural Land Tenure and Paths of SWISLR Adaptation. We will have project from Stoop, so that is the Salting the Earth with Purpose. And we will have people from the Coastal Depot project. And so that's the project we also talked about last month of the database of edaphic plant transitions. And I want to share the general agenda for our workathon and then open up the floor for questions, comments, kind of clarifications, because I know I lasted through that. And I will also share the registration link as well, so that if you did your celebratory cheers or thumbs up or clapping your hands and you have not filled out this registration survey I'm about to send, please fill this out. That is my blast of information. Oh, and Emily says that the goal for STOOP is to go from a rough draft proposal for a globally distributed coastal soil carbon experiment to something much, much closer to submission. So Spencer and Emily will come with lots of specs and plans to pull the project off. So that is the STOOP project.
Hey, Kira, I have one question. Is it,
Yeah.
will they all be going simultaneously? Should we plan for like a full work day, or are they gonna be staggered so that people that are in multiple groups could join to work on different things?
So right now I have it set that the full day is the work that the groups individually want to do. So I think that if you want to take part in multiple groups, that'll be something that you can talk to the group project lead about. And I'm leaving it up to the project leads to kind of set what they want to do and like how long they want to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I also will do a little bit of a ad for the SALT, the Salinity Affected Lands in Transition. We have a lot of SWISLR people presenting at SALT, so there'll be a conference full of really great talks.
Kira, is my microphone working?
Yes, it is.
Yay, okay. So I was going to say, I think we should be thinking about this version of our conferences. We'll have 2.5 whole days of talks right before it. This is sort of, think of it like a writing retreat or work retreat, right? So it's like a way to get ourselves into space where we're not being interrupted. We can put our out-of-office message on our email and actually just make some progress on things where it's just so much easier to do it face to face. So not a ton of programming, but lots of chances to sort of check back in with each other, have meals together, and talk through how things are moving forward.
Yeah, definitely lots of time to interact in person, which I think is very beneficial to get people all into one room and talk about the project, share ideas, share updates, and get things done.
And Kira, you didn't mention, but we're going to do tours of some agricultural farms, right?
Yes, we are. So that is a great point. And now I have 2 things I would like to mention. One is that the night of June 11th, we're going to be doing a documentary screening. So we will get to see, I'm trying to find the name of the documentary again. But the documentary is about issues of flooding in the coastal Maryland area. And the person who created the documentary will be joining us to talk about it as well. And then that will be the night of June 11th. And then the evening of June 12th, so starting at about 3 o'clock, we are going to be getting a tour of SWISLR impacted agricultural lands. And so that is someone who Kate Tully works with a lot, and they are very excited to show us their farm fields that are salinity affected. And G said that the Delarian group will be, am I saying that right? Delarian?
I don't remember the exact word anymore, but it's Delarian or something. Anna can correct me if I've got it wrong.
Okay. But that group will be emailing or meeting with the members before to share some preliminary data and results, and then they can discuss the path forward from there.
Maybe one of our evening goals can be to have better acronyms, because STOOP is a terrible one. And, I'm not sure, although Delarian is funny, I'm not sure it conveys the message of what it's about. So maybe we can all have a fun acronym game or something.
It was the answer to a Trivial Pursuit question I hit the other day.
Well, I will definitely be available throughout these next few months for questions or comments, and I will be also in email contact with a lot of the project leads, so look out for emails from me. And I can give everybody about 10 minutes back to their day, and potentially end the meeting early. You can stick around if you have any more specific questions. And I am very excited for this event and can't wait to see everyone in person again in Maryland. And if you haven't already, please fill out the SWISLR registration so I know if you're coming or not. All right, thank you, everybody. And thanks again, Grace, for sharing the project. Bye, everyone.